what actually happened to women inside Viking Longhouse after raids was more brutal than you think behind the timber walls of Viking Longhouses, where fires burned through endless northern nights and the sounds of celebration echoed after successful raids. There existed a hidden world of systematic brutality that contradicted every romanticized notion of Norse domestic life. When the dragon ships returned laden with treasure and captives, the true horror began not on distant battlefields, but within the seemingly secure confines of these family dwellings, where captured women faced ordeals that transformed these halls of supposed hospitality into chambers of prolonged terror. The wooden beams that witnessed Viking feasts and family gatherings also bore silent testimony to acts of cruelty, so systematic and devastating that they reveal the darkest aspects of Norse society hidden behind the warrior culture's celebrated facade. This is the investigation into the systematic abuse and exploitation of women within Viking Longhouse following successful raids, a practice that unveils the brutal domestic realities concealed beneath the heroic narratives of Norse expansion. Through examination of archaeological evidence from Longhouse excavations across Scandinavia, contemporary accounts from both Norse and foreign sources, legal codes that governed household relationships, analysis of skeletal remains from Longhouse burials, and the testimony preserved in saga literature when stripped of its romantic veneer, we reconstruct the horrifying truth about what happened to captured women once they crossed the thresholds of their captors' homes. Today, we explore the transformation of Viking longhouses from family dwellings into sites of systematic oppression, examining the hierarchical structures that governed the treatment of captive women, the daily routines of exploitation and abuse they endured, the psychological tactics used to break their resistance, and the long-term consequences for both victims and perpetrators within these closed domestic environments. Drawing upon evidence from excavated longhouses at sites like Borg in Norway, Trelleborg in Denmark, and numerous Icelandic farmsteads, along with detailed analysis of household artifacts, sleeping arrangements, and the physical modifications made to accommodate captive populations, we reveal how Viking domestic architecture itself was adapted to facilitate the systematic control and abuse of unwilling inhabitants. The architectural modifications found in Viking longhouses across Scandinavia reveal deliberate design elements intended to facilitate the control and confinement of captive women, suggesting that the systematic abuse of raid victims was not an improvised response, but a planned aspect of Norse domestic organization. Archaeological excavations at major longhouse sites show evidence of secured sleeping areas, reinforced storage spaces that could serve as improvised prisons, and modifications to building layouts that allowed for surveillance and control of specific household members. The discovery of iron restraints and specialized locks within longhouse contexts indicates that Viking families invested considerable resources in creating domestic environments capable of maintaining unwilling inhabitants over extended periods. The daily routines within Viking longhouses created systematic opportunities for the abuse and exploitation of captive women that were integrated into the normal rhythms of Norse family life in ways that normalized cruelty and made resistance extremely difficult. Contemporary legal codes from Iceland and Norway revealed detailed regulations governing the treatment of captive women within household contexts, including specific provisions for their labor obligations, sleeping arrangements, and the rights of household members to use them for various forms of service. These legal frameworks demonstrate that the abuse of captured women was not considered deviant behavior, but was legally sanctioned and socially accepted practice within Viking domestic culture. The hierarchical structures that governed Viking longhouses placed captive women at the absolute bottom of complex social arrangements that determined everything from sleeping locations to food distribution, creating systems of deprivation and privilege that were designed to maintain psychological control through the constant threat of even worse treatment. Archaeological analysis of longhouse layouts reveals sleeping areas that were clearly designed to isolate captive women from other household members while keeping them accessible to their captors, with evidence suggesting that these spaces were often located in the least desirable parts of buildings, near storage areas or livestock pens that emphasized their dehumanized status. The seasonal rhythms of Viking society created particular periods of intensified abuse for captive women, as the return of raiding expeditions brought not only new victims, but also celebrations that often involve the systematic humiliation and exploitation of existing captives as entertainment for successful warriors. Saga literature, when analyzed for historical rather than romantic content, contains scattered references to longhouse feasts where captured women were forced to serve their captors' guests while enduring public abuse that served both as entertainment and as demonstration of their owner's power and status within Viking society. The economic exploitation of captive women within longhouse environments encompassed every aspect of domestic labor, from the most physically demanding tasks to the most intimate personal services, with their unpaid work forming a crucial foundation of Viking household prosperity that enabled free family members to pursue raiding, trading, and political activities. Archaeological evidence from textile production areas within longhouses shows clear signs of intensive labor that exceeded what free household members could reasonably accomplish, suggesting that captive women were forced to work at unsustainable levels to meet both household needs and the production quotas necessary to generate trade goods for external exchange. The psychological warfare employed against captive women within longhouse settings included deliberate policies designed to destroy their connections to their previous lives while forcing them to participate in activities that violated their cultural and religious beliefs. Contemporary accounts describe how Viking households would compel captured Christian women to participate in pagan religious ceremonies, force them to consume foods forbidden by their previous dietary restrictions, and require them to engage in activities that would have been considered shameful or degrading within their original communities. The treatment of children born to captive women within longhouse environments reveals perhaps the most cruel aspects of Viking domestic practices, as these offspring were raised within sight of their mothers, but were typically claimed by their fathers' families and trained to view their mothers as servants rather than parents. Archaeological evidence from children's graves within longhouse compounds shows disparities in burial treatment that correspond to the status of their mothers, with children of captive women receiving fewer grave goods and less elaborate burial preparations than those born to free women. The seasonal isolation of Viking longhouses during harsh Scandinavian winters created particularly brutal conditions for captive women, as the months-long confinement within closed domestic spaces intensified existing patterns of abuse while eliminating any possibility of escape or outside intervention. Archaeological analysis of longhouse heating and lighting systems reveals how the distribution of warmth and illumination within these buildings reinforced social hierarchies, with captive women often relegated to the coldest and darkest areas of structures during the periods when survival depended entirely on access to fire and shelter. The documentation of resistance efforts by captive women within longhouse settings reveals both the desperate measures they employed to preserve their dignity and identity and the increasingly sophisticated methods their captors developed to prevent escape and rebellion. Legal codes contain detailed provisions for punishing various forms of resistance, including specific penalties for attempts at escape, refusal to work, and efforts to communicate with the outside world, suggesting that such resistance was common enough to require systematic legal responses. The medical evidence preserved in skeletal remains from longhouse burials provides stark testimony to the physical toll of life as a captive woman within these domestic environments, with patterns of injuries, malnutrition, and premature death that reveal the systematic nature of the abuse they endured. Bone analysis shows evidence of repetitive stress injuries consistent with forced labor, defensive wounds suggesting ongoing physical violence, and signs of chronic malnutrition that indicate captive women were fed inadequately even when household resources were abundant. The gradual integration of some captive women into Viking family structures created complex dynamics that could provide pathways to improve treatment while requiring complete renunciation of their previous identities and active participation in the oppression of other captives. Archaeological evidence suggests that women who bore children to their captors sometimes achieved higher status within longhouse hierarchies, but legal texts make clear that this elevation remained entirely dependent on their continued compliance and could be revoked at any time. The international dimensions of captive women's experiences within Viking longhouses included their roles as sources of information about foreign lands, languages, and customs that proved valuable to their captors' future raiding and trading activities. Contemporary accounts suggest that longhouse inhabitants were systematically questioned about the locations of wealth, the defenses of settlements, and the political relationships within their home regions, making them unwilling intelligence assets whose survival often depended on their usefulness as informants. The religious and cultural destruction that occurred within longhouse settings encompassed deliberate efforts to force captive women to abandon their spiritual beliefs and cultural practices while compelling them to participate in Norse religious ceremonies that they considered blasphemous or degrading. Archaeological evidence of modified household shrines and religious artifacts suggests that Viking families made specific adaptations to their domestic religious practices that incorporated the forced participation of captive women in ways that emphasized their subjugation and cultural dispossession. The economic calculations that governed the treatment of captive women within longhouse balanced their value as workers and potential mothers against the costs of maintaining them, creating systems of exploitation that maximized their productive capacity while minimizing investment in their well-being or comfort. Legal texts reveal detailed frameworks for determining when captive women had become too old, sick, or troublesome to justify continued maintenance, with provisions for their disposal that ranged from sale to other households to ritual sacrifice during religious ceremonies. The legacy of Longhouse captivity extended far beyond the immediate victims to influence the development of Norse family structures, gender relationships, and domestic culture in ways that normalized violence against women and created expectations of female subservience that affected even free-born Norse women. The systematic brutalization of captive women within domestic settings established patterns of household authority and gender relations that shaped Viking society for generations and influenced the development of Scandinavian culture well beyond the end of the Viking Age. As we confront the brutal realities of what occurred within Viking longhouses after successful raids, we must acknowledge that these domestic spaces, which have often been romanticized as centers of family warmth and hospitality, were also sites of systematic human rights violations that reveal the most disturbing aspects of Norse society. The women who suffered within these seemingly secure dwellings faced ordeals that combined physical abuse with psychological torture, cultural destruction, and complete social isolation in ways that were designed to break their spirits while extracting maximum economic value from their unwilling labor. The story of captive women within Viking longhouses reminds us that historical truth often contradicts popular narratives, and that understanding the full reality of past civilizations requires us to examine not only their public achievements, but also their private cruelties, recognizing that the domestic sphere has often served as a hidden theater for some of history's most systematic and devastating forms of human oppression.